At its peak, the British Empire was the largest empire the world had ever seen. It ruled over nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and governed more than 400 million people. Its red-colored territories stretched across every inhabited continent, touching almost every major ocean and trade route on the planet. To many observers at the time, British power looked eternal, an empire so vast, so wealthy, and so dominant that collapse seemed unthinkable. And yet, behind this image of invincibility lay a financial reality far more fragile than anyone dared to admit. This is the story of how an empire that owned the world repeatedly lost control of its own finances. Not once, not twice, but 9 separate times. These were not minor budget problems or temporary shortages. They were full-scale sovereign debt crises, moments when the British state either defaulted, restructured, suspended payments, or came dangerously close to financial ruin. To understand how this was possible, we must first dismantle one of history's greatest illusions, the belief that empire automatically meant wealth. From the outside, Britain's rise appeared unstoppable. By the late 17th century, the country had transformed from a relatively small European kingdom into a global commercial powerhouse. Its navy dominated the seas, its merchants controlled trade routes, and its colonies supplied raw materials from every corner of the globe. London became the financial heart of the world, home to banks, insurers, and investors who financed everything from wars to railways. But empires are not built on gold alone. They are built on debt. The British state learned early that war was expensive, far more expensive than taxation alone could support. Instead of relying solely on immediate revenue, Britain pioneered something revolutionary: long-term government borrowing on an unprecedented scale. Through institutions like the Bank of England, founded in 1694, the state could raise enormous sums by promising future repayment. This system allowed Britain to fight longer wars than its rivals, but it also locked the empire into a permanent cycle of debt. Every major expansion of the empire came with a financial cost. Wars against France, Spain, and later Napoleonic Europe required massive fleets, standing armies, and global logistics networks. Colonies were not self-sustaining at first. They had to be defended, administered, and supplied. Forts were built, soldiers paid, ships repaired, and bureaucracies expanded. These expenses often arrived decades before any meaningful economic return. Empire was an investment, but one with delayed and uncertain profits. The public narrative told a different story. British leaders portrayed colonies as fountains of wealth, claiming that India, the Caribbean, Africa, and North America poured riches into the imperial treasury. In reality, much of the profit never reached the state at all. It flowed instead into private hands: trading companies, plantation owners, shipping magnates, and financiers. The crown collected taxes, yes, but it also shouldered the overwhelming cost of protection and governance. The imbalance was structural, and it was dangerous. One of the clearest examples of this contradiction was the British East India Company. Often described as the engine of imperial wealth, the company controlled vast territories in South Asia and commanded its own private army. Yet despite its immense power, the company itself repeatedly teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. When it collapsed financially in the 1770s, it was not rescued by colonial profits, it was rescued by British taxpayers. The empire, once again, absorbed private failure into public debt. By the 18th century, Britain had normalized borrowing as a way of life. National debt rose steadily, climbing after every major war and never fully returning to previous levels. Politicians reassured the public that debt was manageable, that economic growth and colonial trade would always outpace interest payments. For a time, this belief seemed justified. Britain avoided the sudden collapses that plagued other empires. Instead, it survived by refinancing old debts with new ones, pushing the problem further into the future. But this system had limits. Debt made Britain powerful, but it also made it vulnerable. A single shock, an expensive war, a trade disruption, a financial panic, could threaten the entire structure. The empire's strength depended not only on ships and soldiers, but on confidence. As long as investors believed Britain would repay its debts, the system worked. The moment that confidence wavered, everything was at risk. This vulnerability became most visible during moments of crisis. Wars did not merely drain resources, they exposed how thin the empire's financial margins truly were. When revenues fell or expenses surged, Britain faced difficult choices: raise taxes and risk unrest, cut military spending and risk defeat, or borrow even more and gamble on the future. Time and again, the empire chose to gamble. What made the situation even more paradoxical was that Britain often appeared richest precisely when it was most indebted. Victories expanded territory, increased trade, and boosted national pride, but they also locked the state into higher long-term costs. Every new colony meant new obligations. Every conquered port required defense. Every trade route demanded patrols. The empire grew outward while its finances hollowed from within. This is why British bankruptcy never looked like sudden collapse. There were no dramatic moments when the empire vanished overnight. Instead, there were silent defaults, quiet restructurings, emergency loans, and suspended payments hidden behind complex financial language. The empire survived not because it was financially healthy, but because it was financially sophisticated. It knew how to delay reckoning, yet delay is not escape. Over the next 2 centuries, Britain would stumble again and again into financial crises, some caused by war, others by speculation, and others by the simple weight of maintaining global dominance. Each crisis left scars. Each forced painful adjustments. And each brought the empire closer to the realization that no amount of territory could guarantee economic security. In this series, we will uncover those 9 moments, 9 times when the world's most powerful empire lost control of its finances. We will see how ambition turned into overreach, how confidence turned into denial, and how an empire that owned the world repeatedly failed to own its own balance sheet. Because the greatest lesson of the British Empire is not how power is gained, but how easily it can be mortgaged away. The first major cracks in the financial foundations of the British Empire did not appear during defeat, but during victory. In the 18th century, Britain fought and won some of the most important wars in modern history. These conflicts expanded imperial territory, crushed rivals, and confirmed Britain as a global superpower. Yet each triumph carried an invisible cost. Victory, it turned out, was far more expensive than anyone had planned for. By the mid-1700s, Britain was locked into near-constant warfare with other European powers, especially France. These wars were no longer confined to Europe. They were global struggles fought across North America, the Caribbean, Africa, India, and the high seas. Ships had to be built and maintained, soldiers recruited and paid, supplies transported across oceans, and allies bribed or subsidized. The empire's military machine was vast, and its appetite for money was endless. The most devastating of these conflicts was the 7 Years' War, often described as the First True World War. Britain emerged victorious, gaining enormous territories in North America and South Asia. On paper, the empire had never looked stronger. In reality, the British state was financially exhausted. Government debt had nearly doubled during the war, reaching levels that terrified even experienced financiers. Interest payments alone consumed a massive portion of annual revenue. To service this debt, Britain faced a brutal dilemma. Taxes at home were already high, and further increases risked unrest among the population. The alternative was to extract revenue from the colonies that had supposedly benefited from British protection. For policymakers in London, this seemed reasonable. For colonists, especially in North America, it was intolerable. They had not agreed to pay for imperial wars decided an ocean away. What followed was a slow-moving financial and political disaster. Britain introduced new taxes and duties on the American colonies, hoping to stabilize state finances. Instead, these measures triggered resistance, boycotts, and eventually rebellion. The attempt to solve a debt crisis through colonial taxation directly contributed to the loss of Britain's most valuable settler colonies. Financial desperation had produced strategic self-destruction. The American War of Independence was catastrophic for British finances. Fighting the rebellion required enormous military expenditure at a time when the state was already drowning in debt. Borrowing accelerated once again. By the war's end, Britain had lost territory, prestige, and revenue streams, but it had kept the debt. Worse still, confidence in British fiscal stability began to weaken for the first time in generations. This moment marks what many historians consider Britain's first true sovereign debt crisis. While the state did not announce an outright default, it was forced into what we would now call financial repression. Interest rates were manipulated, payments were delayed, and emergency measures were taken to prevent collapse. Credit markets tightened. Investors demanded higher returns. The empire survived, but barely. What made this crisis particularly dangerous was that it shattered a powerful myth, the belief that expansion always paid for itself. Britain had won territory, but it had lost fiscal control. The empire had grown larger, yet the state was weaker. This contradiction would haunt British policymakers for centuries. The crisis also revealed a deeper structural problem. Britain's financial system depended on credibility. As long as lenders believed the state would honor its obligations, borrowing was cheap and abundant. But credibility is fragile. Once shaken, it demands constant reassurance. From this point forward, British leaders governed not just with armies and navies, but with an anxious eye on bond markets. The response to this crisis reshaped the empire. Britain became more cautious about direct colonial administration and more reliant on indirect control, trade dominance, and financial leverage. At the same time, it doubled down on borrowing as a permanent feature of governance. Debt was no longer a temporary wartime tool. It became a structural pillar of imperial power, yet the underlying problem remained unresolved. Wars continued. Military spending remained high. And each new conflict added another layer to an already towering mountain of debt. The empire was not learning how to avoid bankruptcy, it was learning how to live dangerously close to it. This pattern repeated itself during the long wars against revolutionary and Napoleonic France at the turn of the 19th century. Britain ultimately prevailed, but only by borrowing on a scale never before attempted. By 1815, national debt had reached more than 200% of GDP, an astonishing figure even by modern standards. Britain had won the war for Europe, but at the cost of financial vulnerability that would shape its future. For ordinary citizens, this translated into decades of high taxes, suppressed wages, and limited public spending. The empire's victories were celebrated with monuments and parades, while the financial burden was quietly passed down through generations. Debt became invisible, abstract, and normalized. Bankruptcy no longer looked like collapse, it looked like stagnation, austerity, and slow decline. This was the moment when British bankruptcy changed character. It was no longer a single dramatic event. It became a recurring condition, a chronic illness rather than a sudden death. The state avoided default not by becoming solvent, but by becoming indispensable to the global financial system. London emerged as the world's clearinghouse of credit, allowing Britain to borrow because the world itself depended on British finance, but this strategy came with a price. Every future crisis would now threaten not just Britain, but the global economy tied to it. The empire had bound its fate to debt so tightly that disentanglement became impossible. Power, prosperity, and peril were now inseparable. We will follow Britain into the 19th century, where industrial growth masked financial weakness, and where imperial confidence hid a dangerous truth. The empire was no longer expanding to escape debt, it was expanding because it could not afford to stop. By the early 19th century, the British Empire appeared to have solved its financial problems. The wars with Napoleonic France were over, Britain stood victorious, and a new force had emerged to transform the nation's fortunes: industrialization. Factories multiplied, machines replaced muscle, and productivity exploded. Coal, iron, steam, and railways reshaped the economy at a speed the world had never seen. To contemporaries, it looked like Britain had finally found the formula for permanent prosperity, but this prosperity concealed a dangerous illusion. Industrial growth did not eliminate Britain's debt problem, it masked it. The end of the Napoleonic Wars left Britain with an enormous financial burden. National debt hovered at unprecedented levels, exceeding 200% of national income. Interest payments consumed a vast share of government revenue, leaving little room for public investment or social relief. Instead of defaulting outright, Britain chose a different path. It imposed decades of austerity. Taxes remained high, public spending was restrained, and economic pain was absorbed quietly by the population. Industrial expansion made this strategy politically survivable. As factories spread and exports increased, the overall economy grew, allowing the state to service its debt without formal bankruptcy. But this growth was uneven and deeply unequal. Wealth concentrated in industrialists, merchants, and financiers, while workers endured low wages, long hours, and brutal living conditions. The empire looked rich from the top, but financially fragile at its core. London emerged as the nerve center of global finance. Banks, insurers, and investors transformed the city into the world's primary capital market. British money financed railways in Latin America, mines in Africa, and infrastructure across Asia. This global financial dominance gave Britain a powerful advantage. It could borrow cheaply because it controlled the system others relied on. Debt became manageable not because it was small, but because it was trusted. This trust, however, depended on constant stability. Any disruption, economic panic, trade collapse, or imperial crisis, threatened the delicate balance. And disruptions came frequently. Throughout the 19th century, Britain experienced repeated financial shocks. Banking crises erupted in 1825, 1837, 1847, and 1857. Each panic exposed how overstretched the financial system had become. Credit dried up, businesses collapsed, and unemployment surged. Time and again, the government and the Bank of England were forced to intervene, suspending normal rules to prevent systemic collapse. These interventions were, in effect, quiet bailouts. While Britain avoided declaring bankruptcy, it repeatedly bent its own financial principles to survive. Gold standards were relaxed, emergency liquidity was injected, and creditors were reassured at almost any cost. Stability mattered more than discipline. The empire learned that survival depended on flexibility, even if that meant undermining the very rules it claimed to uphold. Meanwhile, the empire expanded aggressively. Industrial Britain required raw materials and markets, and colonies supplied both. Railways were built across India, Africa, and Southeast Asia, not primarily for local development, but to extract resources efficiently. These projects were often financed through British loans, guaranteed by colonial governments. When revenues fell short, the imperial state absorbed the losses. This created a second hidden layer of debt, colonial liabilities. While not always recorded directly on Britain's balance sheet, these obligations ultimately rested on imperial authority. Colonial defaults, rebellions, or economic failures threatened British credit just as much as domestic crises. Empire did not reduce financial risk, it multiplied it across continents. One of the most revealing contradictions of this era was how Britain preached financial discipline abroad while practicing flexibility at home. Other countries were pressured to honor debts strictly, often under threat of military or economic coercion. Britain, by contrast, quietly restructured its own obligations whenever necessary. Power determined the rules. By mid-century, the empire had perfected the art of postponement. Debt was rolled over indefinitely. Old obligations were refinanced with new ones. As long as economic growth continued and confidence held, the system functioned. But this was not solvency, it was endurance. Industrialization also created new vulnerabilities. Britain's economy became deeply dependent on global trade. Any disruption to shipping lanes, commodity flows, or foreign markets could have immediate consequences. The empire's wealth was mobile and fragile, tied to far-flung territories it struggled to control fully. Military strength could conquer land, but it could not guarantee profits. The illusion of stability began to crack toward the end of the 19th century. Competition intensified as other industrial powers, Germany, the United States, and Japan, rose rapidly. Britain's relative economic dominance declined, even as its imperial commitments remained vast. The empire was now maintaining global supremacy with shrinking margins. This mismatch was fatal. Britain still governed enormous territories, but it no longer generated enough surplus to support them effortlessly. Debt stopped shrinking and began to stabilize at high levels. The state remained solvent, but only just. Bankruptcy had not been defeated. It had been delayed. For ordinary people, the costs were visible everywhere. Urban poverty, labor unrest, and political radicalism surged. The wealth of empire failed to translate into widespread prosperity at home. The financial system protected creditors and investors first, citizens second. Stability was purchased with inequality. By the dawn of the 20th century, Britain stood at a crossroads. It was still the world's largest empire, still the center of global finance, and still immensely powerful. Yet beneath the surface, its financial resilience was weakening. The empire had survived its early debt crises by growing, industrializing, and globalizing. But growth had limits. Globalization created exposure. And the next shock would be unlike anything Britain had faced before. We will see how total war shattered the illusion of industrial security, and pushed the British Empire into its most severe financial crisis yet, one that would permanently alter the balance of global power. The First World War did not merely wound the British Empire. It nearly broke it. When war erupted in 1914, Britain entered the conflict with confidence born of habit. For more than 2 centuries, it had financed wars through borrowing, emerged victorious, and absorbed the costs over time. Policymakers believed this war would be no different. They were catastrophically wrong. What followed was not just another expensive conflict, but a total war, one that consumed entire economies, societies, and financial systems. From the very beginning, the scale of expenditure was unprecedented. Millions of soldiers had to be recruited, trained, armed, transported, and supplied. Industry was rapidly converted to wartime production. Ships, tanks, artillery, ammunition, and aircraft poured out of factories at astonishing speed. The state intervened directly in the economy, directing labor, fixing prices, and commandeering resources. Britain was no longer merely fighting a war, it was reorganizing civilization around it. The cost was staggering. Government spending multiplied many times over, far exceeding anything Britain had experienced during the Napoleonic era. Taxation increased sharply, but it could not keep pace. Once again, the solution was borrowing, but now on a global scale. Britain sold war bonds to its citizens, appealing to patriotism to finance survival. Entire generations invested their savings in the promise of victory. Even this was not enough. By 1916, Britain had exhausted its financial reserves. Gold flowed out of the country to pay for food, weapons, and supplies imported from abroad. For the first time in its history, Britain was forced to rely heavily on loans from another power, the United States. The empire that had once financed the world now depended on foreign credit to continue fighting. This marked a profound turning point. Financial independence, long a pillar of British power, was slipping away. The empire remained militarily formidable, but economically it was being hollowed out. When the war finally ended in 1918, Britain emerged on the winning side, yet victory brought no relief. The bills were just beginning to arrive. National debt exploded to levels that dwarfed even those of the Napoleonic Wars. Interest payments alone became a crushing burden. Britain had avoided outright default during the war, but only by suspending financial norms and draining its reserves. In practical terms, the empire was now living on borrowed time. The post-war years revealed how fragile the situation truly was. Britain attempted to restore pre-war financial stability by returning to the gold standard, a decision intended to signal strength and credibility. Instead, it proved disastrous. The value of the pound was fixed at an unrealistically high level, making British exports uncompetitive and strangling economic growth. Unemployment surged. Industrial regions fell into long-term decline. Government revenues weakened just as debt obligations remained fixed. Britain found itself trapped, unable to grow fast enough to escape debt, yet unwilling to devalue its currency for fear of losing financial prestige. The empire chose reputation over recovery. This decision pushed Britain to the brink of default once again. By the mid-1920s, the state was forced to implement severe austerity measures. Public spending was cut, wages were suppressed, and social tensions exploded. The general strike of 1926 was not just a labor dispute, it was a symptom of financial exhaustion. The empire was demanding sacrifice from its people to protect its creditors. The illusion of imperial wealth had fully collapsed. Colonies no longer generated easy surpluses. Instead, they required subsidies, military presence, and administrative costs. The empire had become a liability rather than an asset. Yet abandoning it was politically unthinkable. Britain remained trapped by its own legacy. The situation deteriorated further with the onset of the Great Depression. Global trade collapsed, capital flows dried up, and confidence evaporated. Britain faced another sovereign crisis. In 1931, under immense pressure, the government was forced to abandon the gold standard. The pound was devalued, and Britain effectively admitted that it could no longer uphold the financial order it had once designed. This moment is often described as a policy shift. In reality, it was a quiet admission of failure. Britain had not defaulted in name, but it had broken its most sacred financial promise. The empire survived, but only by surrendering a core symbol of economic dominance. The Second World War delivered the final blow. If the First World War had weakened Britain financially, the Second nearly destroyed its solvency entirely. Once again, total war demanded total mobilization. Once again, spending exploded. But this time, Britain began the conflict already weakened, already indebted, already dependent on foreign support. By 1945, Britain was effectively bankrupt. Its overseas investments had been liquidated. Its infrastructure was damaged. Its population exhausted. The empire that had once ruled global finance now relied on emergency assistance from the United States just to feed itself. Victory came at the cost of financial sovereignty. This was not merely a temporary crisis. It marked the irreversible decline of imperial power. Britain could no longer afford to maintain its empire, defend its colonies, and service its debts simultaneously. Something had to give. What followed was not collapse, but retreat. The empire began to unravel, not because Britain lost militarily, but because it lost financially. Independence movements accelerated. Strategic withdrawals replaced expansion. Power shifted across the Atlantic. The age of British financial dominance was over. We will explore how the post-war world exposed the final illusion that Britain could remain a global empire without global money, and how decolonization was driven as much by bankruptcy as by politics. By the end of the Second World War, the British Empire still appeared immense on the map. Red territories stretched across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific. To casual observers, Britain remained a global power. But appearances were deceiving. Behind the symbols of authority, flags, governors, garrisons, the empire was financially exhausted. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but something quieter and more revealing, an empire dismantled by insolvency. In 1945, Britain faced a reality it could no longer escape. The war had drained its reserves, destroyed much of its infrastructure, and left the state drowning in debt. Overseas investments that once generated income had been sold off to pay for survival. Foreign exchange reserves were critically low. Even basic imports like food and fuel depended on external financing. The empire still existed, but Britain could no longer afford to run it. The most immediate crisis was currency. The pound sterling, once the backbone of global trade, was under constant pressure. Britain maintained a vast sterling area, forcing colonies and allied countries to hold their reserves in pounds. In theory, this propped up Britain's finances. In practice, it became a trap. Any loss of confidence risked a run on sterling that Britain had no means to stop. At home, austerity defined everyday life. Rationing continued well into the late 1940s and early 1950s. Housing shortages were severe. Public finances were stretched to the limit as Britain attempted to build a welfare state while servicing colossal war debts. Every pound spent on empire was a pound not spent on domestic recovery. Imperial prestige now directly competed with social survival. The contradiction was unsustainable. The first major break came in South Asia. India had long been portrayed as the jewel in the crown of the empire, but by the mid-20th century, it had become a financial and political liability. Maintaining control required troops, administrators, and constant expenditure. At the same time, nationalist movements made governance increasingly costly and unstable. In 1947, Britain granted independence to India and Pakistan. This decision is often framed as a moral or political turning point. It was also a financial one. Britain simply could not afford prolonged conflict or continued administration. Independence was not just conceded, it was accelerated by bankruptcy. Letting go was cheaper than holding on. This pattern repeated itself across the empire. From Southeast Asia to the Middle East, Britain reassessed its commitments through the lens of cost. Colonies that did not pay for themselves, or required heavy military presence, were quietly marked for exit. Decolonization was not driven by idealism alone. It was an accounting exercise. Nowhere was this reality more brutally exposed than during the Suez Crisis. In 1956, Britain, alongside France, attempted to assert control over the Suez Canal after its nationalization by Egypt. Militarily, the operation was feasible. Politically and financially, it was catastrophic. International pressure, particularly from the United States, forced Britain to withdraw. Worse still, the crisis triggered a run on the pound. Within days, Britain faced the real possibility of financial collapse. Emergency support from international institutions became necessary. The message was unmistakable: Britain could no longer act as an independent imperial power. Financial weakness had overridden military capability. Suez was not just a diplomatic humiliation, it was a public declaration of bankruptcy at the imperial level. After Suez, the illusion finally died. British policymakers accepted what debt had been saying for years: empire was no longer affordable. Military bases were closed. Troops were withdrawn. Colonial administrations were dismantled. Independence movements, once resisted, were now negotiated and expedited. The empire did not fall, it was liquidated. What replaced it was not renewed prosperity, but adjustment. Britain struggled throughout the 1960s and 1970s with recurring balance of payments crises. The pound was devalued multiple times. Emergency loans became routine. In 1976, Britain turned to the International Monetary Fund for assistance, an act unthinkable at the height of imperial power. The empire that once dictated global finance now had to accept external supervision of its economy. These were not isolated failures. They were the final chapters of a long story. Britain's repeated flirtations with bankruptcy had shaped every major imperial decision for centuries. Expansion had been financed by debt. Survival had depended on confidence. And decline had arrived when confidence could no longer be maintained. Decolonization was not a loss of ambition, it was an admission of limits. Britain remained a nation of influence, culture, and history. But it was no longer an empire that owned the world. The age of living beyond its financial means was over, or so it seemed. We will bring the story full circle, counting all 9 bankruptcies, examining what they reveal about power and debt, and asking the most uncomfortable question of all: whether modern empires have learned anything at all from Britain's financial downfall. The story of the British Empire does not end with independence ceremonies or the lowering of colonial flags. It ends with something far less dramatic, but far more revealing: a reckoning with numbers. Balance sheets. Interest rates. Exchange reserves. Because when the emotion is stripped away, the empire's ultimate failure was not moral, military, or cultural, it was financial. Across 3 centuries, Britain experienced what can reasonably be described as 9 sovereign bankruptcy episodes. Some were formal. Others were disguised through restructurings, suspensions, currency devaluations, or emergency interventions. But all shared the same core reality: the state could not meet its obligations under existing conditions. The first crises emerged in the late 17th and 18th centuries, when Britain pioneered modern national debt. War after war forced the government to borrow beyond its immediate means. Defaults were avoided only through delayed payments and financial repression. The empire survived by inventing credibility, but credibility came at the price of permanent indebtedness. The second wave arrived after the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. Victory expanded territory but destroyed fiscal balance. Britain's inability to stabilize its finances without provoking rebellion exposed the limits of imperial taxation. What looked like political loss was, at its heart, a debt crisis. The Napoleonic Wars produced the third and most dangerous escalation. By 1815, Britain's debt burden had reached historic highs. The state avoided collapse through decades of austerity and inflationary pressure, silently transferring the cost to future generations. Bankruptcy was postponed, not prevented. The fourth and fifth crises unfolded during the 19th century's financial panics. Banking collapses forced repeated suspensions of gold convertibility and emergency interventions by the Bank of England. Britain did not default openly, but it repeatedly abandoned its own financial rules to survive. The sixth crisis arrived with the First World War. The empire exhausted its reserves and lost financial independence, becoming dependent on foreign credit. Post-war attempts to restore credibility only deepened economic damage, pushing Britain to the edge of insolvency once again. The seventh came during the Great Depression, when Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931. This was not a policy experiment, it was a forced retreat. The empire admitted that it could no longer uphold the financial system it once imposed on others. The eighth crisis followed the Second World War. Britain emerged victorious but bankrupt in practice. Overseas assets were gone. Debts were overwhelming. Emergency loans became essential for basic survival. Imperial power had been won militarily and lost financially. The ninth and final episode arrived in 1976, when Britain turned to the International Monetary Fund for assistance. This moment symbolized the end of an era. The former imperial banker of the world now required supervision to manage its own economy. The cycle was complete. These were not accidents. They were the predictable outcome of a system built on the assumption that power could outrun arithmetic. The British Empire mastered one thing better than any empire before it: delay. When faced with insolvency, it borrowed. When borrowing became expensive, it restructured. When credibility weakened, it changed the rules. When all else failed, it retreated, but always just enough to survive. Bankruptcy was never allowed to be final. It was managed, disguised, and deferred. This is why the empire lasted so long. But it is also why its decline was inevitable. Empire creates obligations faster than it creates revenue. Armies, navies, administrations, and infrastructure demand constant funding. Colonies promise wealth, but they deliver costs first, and often never repay them fully. The larger the empire grows, the more fragile its finances become. Power amplifies risk. Britain's greatest illusion was not believing it was powerful. It was believing that power itself was wealth. In the modern world, the British Empire is often remembered nostalgically, as a civilizing force, a trading empire, or a global stabilizer. Rarely is it remembered as what it truly was: a debt machine operating at planetary scale. Its influence reshaped the world, but its finances were always one crisis away from collapse. The lesson is uncomfortable, which is why it is often ignored. No empire is too big to fail. No currency is immune to confidence. No amount of territory can override mathematics. When obligations grow faster than productive capacity, bankruptcy is not a possibility, it is a matter of time. Britain survived 9 times by adapting, retreating, and redefining success. It lost its empire, but it preserved its state. That choice, between prestige and solvency, is one every empire eventually faces. The British Empire chose survival, and in doing so, it revealed the final truth of global power: the world can be owned. Debt cannot.